The workshop door closed behind him, and the night took him the way darkness always did when there was no competing light anywhere on the horizon, completely without gradation. The kind of dark that a person raised in the modern world never fully experienced, because the modern world had spent a century making sure it never got that dark anywhere people lived. Hank had experienced it before. In the years of surface drills, he had run at odd hours to keep his instincts calibrated. But those drills had always had a return built into them. Step out, assess, step back down. Tonight had no return built into it. Not yet. And the absence of that safety net was a physical sensation he noted without judgment and filed under variables accounted for. He stood against the workshop wall for his 2 minutes of listening and let the night tell him what it had. Wind from the northwest, light and steady. Dead leaves moving in the tree line 40 yards east. The specific silence of a world with no electrical hum anywhere in it, which he'd been living with for 30 days underground, but which hit differently on the surface where it had no walls to contain it. It was vast out here. The silence was vast. He had not fully appreciated that from the monitors. He moved off the wall and crossed the open ground to the tree line in the same low direct line he had used the night before, covering the distance in under 30 seconds, and went still inside the first layer of timber. Nothing responded to his movement. The night stayed exactly what it was, empty and enormous and indifferent. He turned north and began moving parallel to the tree line before angling east, putting distance between himself and the direct line from the bunker entrance before he committed to any route that had a destination attached to it. This was the first principle of trail discipline as he had always understood it. Never walk a straight line between where you came from and where you are going, because a straight line is a story and a story can be read. He wanted to leave no story on the landscape tonight. He wanted to pass through it the way water passed through a field after rain, present and then gone, and leaving nothing behind that said which direction it had come from. The terrain east of his property was a mix he knew from years of walking it in better times. Hardwood timber giving way to scrub and old field, then a section of low ground that collected water in wet seasons and stayed soft longer than the surrounding soil, then the gradual rise toward the county road corridor where the farms got larger and the tree cover thinned. He had mapped it in his head during the planning sessions underground, and he had walked it once the previous night, but walking it with a specific destination and a time constraint in a world that had fundamentally changed was different from knowing it abstractly and different again from the brief transit he had made the night before when the objective was observation rather than commitment. He noticed things on this path that he had not fully registered the previous night because his attention had been allocated differently. The smell was the most immediate. Not the clean, cold air he associated with October nights in this part of the country, but something underneath it, a low chemical edge that it caught briefly the night before and now identified more precisely. Burn, old burn, days old at minimum. The specific residue of things that had burned hot and been left to cool without anyone managing the aftermath. Not with fire, structural fire. The kind of smell that came from a building that had gone up with everything in it. It was coming from the east, and it was diffuse enough that the source was not close, but it was present and consistent, and it told him something about the state of the landscape he was moving into that his cameras had not been positioned to show him. He logged it mentally and kept moving. The low ground section slowed in the way he had anticipated. The soil was soft from recent rain, and he picked his way across it on the firmest line available, staying on grass root mats and avoiding the bare patches where his boots would have left clean impressions. It added 7 minutes to his transit time, and he adjusted his internal timeline accordingly. He was not in a hurry in the sense that hurry produced mistakes, but he was operating within a window that had fixed edges, and every minute of buffer he burned in transit was a minute he didn't have at the objective. The scrub section beyond the low ground was where he first saw evidence of what 30 days without order had done to landscape at a human scale. A vehicle sat at the edge of the old field where the scrub began. A pickup, late model, both doors open, sitting at the angle of something that had been abandoned in motion rather than parked. He had seen it on his north camera weeks ago and logged it as a single data point. Up close, it was more than a data point. The cab had been gone through. Contents pulled out and scattered across the ground around it. The kind of search that happened when someone was desperate enough to go through a stranger's vehicle looking for anything useful. Whatever had been useful was gone. What remained was the debris of someone else's desperation, frozen in place by the fact that nobody had come back to clean it up and nobody was going to. He gave the vehicle a wide berth, not because he expected anyone to be near it, but because it represented a point of prior human activity, and points of prior human activity attracted repeat visits from people who were running out of options. He moved past it and into the scrub, and the old field swallowed him, and he kept east. The Walker patrol patterns he had memorized from 30 days of camera footage were his primary navigation tool for the section of route that brought him within a mile of the county road. He knew the dawn window was the high activity period and that midnight was the lowest, but low was not zero, and he had committed the route variations he had observed to memory with enough precision that he could anticipate where patrol was likely to be at any given point in the cycle and route around it before he was close enough for the routing to matter. He was not going to see them before he needed to avoid them. He was going to avoid the places they were before he got there. That distinction was the difference between reactive evasion and proactive discipline, and it was the reason he had spent 30 days watching instead of moving. The information from those 30 days was the most valuable thing he was carrying tonight, more valuable than the bolt cutters or the sidearm, because information was what turned a dangerous situation into a manageable one, and what turned a manageable situation into a controlled one. He reached the high ground at the eastern edge of the old field property and went to one knee behind a line of scrub cedars that gave him a view north along the county road corridor without exposing his outline against the sky. From here, he could see the water tower. It rose above the tree line 1.5 miles to his northeast, its shape distinct against the clear sky, the 3/4 moon giving it enough relief to read its position accurately. He studied the ground between his position and the tower for 3 full minutes, looking for movement, for light, for any indication of patrol activity in this section of the corridor. Nothing moved. The road was a dark line running north-south below him, empty in both directions as far as the moonlight let him see. He stood, crossed the road at a low run, and moved into the timber on the far side without pausing. He was across the county road. He was in the sector Voss's. People had been working for 30 days. He kept moving and did not let himself think about what that meant until he was deep enough in the timber that the road was no longer visible behind him. The timber on the east side of the county road was different in character from the hardwood stands on his own property. Younger growth, denser at ground level, the kind of secondary forest that had come up on land that had been cleared and then abandoned sometime in the previous 20 years. It was good cover and difficult movement, the two things existing in direct proportion to each other the way they always did in terrain that hadn't been managed for human transit. He picked his way through it on a northeast heading, using the water tower as his reference when gaps in the canopy let him see the sky, and came out of the timber after roughly 20 minutes into the edge of what had been a cultivated field. The field was fallow, had been for at least one season before the collapse based on the state of the vegetation, and the growth across it was knee-high and dry, the kind of cover that was good for concealment and produced noise with every step if you weren't deliberate about foot placement. He was deliberate. He moved across the field on a diagonal that kept him away from the fence lines on either side, which were the natural routes patrol would walk, and reached the far edge in 11 minutes, without producing any sound he couldn't account for. Beyond the field was a gravel lane running east, and beyond the gravel lane was the farm property where the facility was located. He had seen the lane on his aerial map study, and had planned to cross it rather than follow it, because lanes were lines and lines were stories. He crossed it in 4 steps and moved into the overgrown ditch on the far side, and went still. From the ditch, he could see the roof line of the barn above the intervening vegetation, closer than he'd expected, which meant his navigation had been cleaner than he had given himself credit for. He could also see the satellite antenna on the prefab communications unit catching moonlight above the barn's near gable. Both structures exactly where he had placed them in his mental map. He checked his watch. He had been on the surface for 1 hour and 43 minutes. The 2 a.m. guard rotation window was 3 hours and 17 minutes out. He had time to conduct a proper reconnaissance of the facility before he committed to the extraction approach. Time to confirm what he thought he knew and identify anything the previous night's brief observation had missed. He settled into the ditch with his back against the near bank and his eyes on the roofline, and began the slow, patient process of learning a place well enough to move through it in the dark with 3 people who had never seen it. Patience was not something Hank had ever had to cultivate. It had always been native to him, the same way the other things were native to him. The stillness, the discipline, the capacity to sit with discomfort without letting it drive his decisions. What he felt in the ditch was not impatience. What he felt was a specific quality of alertness that came from being exactly where the situation required him to be, doing exactly what the situation required him to do, with enough preparation behind him that the variables felt manageable rather than overwhelming. He had been underground for 30 days building to this moment. The moment felt like what it was, the thing all the preparation had been for. He watched the roof line and the antenna and the dark strip of ground between the barn and the prefab, and he waited, and he learned, and the night moved around him without knowing he was in it. He stayed in the ditch for 40 minutes before he moved again. In those 40 minutes, he counted 2 guard passes on the near side of the barn, single individuals, not pairs, moving along the wall at intervals. He clocked at approximately 22 minutes apart. That was longer than the rotation Cass had described in her transmission, which had implied a tighter cycle, and the discrepancy was worth understanding before he committed to an approach built around timing. He had sourced from someone who had been observing from inside a locked barn with limited sight lines. He adjusted his estimate and built a new timing model around what he was actually seeing rather than what he had been told, which was not a reflection on Cass, but a reflection on the fact that ground truth always superseded secondhand intelligence, and a man who forgot that got people killed. The guard on the near side was moving without urgency, which told Hank 2 things. First, whoever was running this facility had not received any indication that the perimeter had been breached the previous night, which meant his entry and exit had been clean. Second, the guard's lack of urgency was itself a vulnerability. A person moving without urgency was a person whose attention was distributed rather than focused, and distributed attention missed things that focused attention caught. He filed both observations and kept watching. The prefab communications unit showed light in one window, a dim, consistent glow that suggested equipment running on low power rather than active personnel at a workstation. He watched that window for 15 minutes without seeing movement behind it. Either the overnight operator was absent or stationary, and he couldn't determine which from the ditch without getting closer, and getting closer to the communications unit was not part of tonight's objective. He needed to understand the guard pattern, confirm the barn lock configuration, and identify his extraction route from the barn to the field crossing he had used on the approach. Everything else was noise. He moved out of the ditch at the 20-minute mark in the guard cycle, giving himself the maximum buffer before the next pass, and worked his way along the fence line on the south side of the property toward the barn's near corner. The ground here was firmer than the low section he had crossed earlier, and he moved faster as a result, covering the distance of the corner in under 3 minutes and pressing himself against the metal siding in the shadow cast by the barn's roof line blocking the moon. From the corner, he could see the barn door on the near face, a large sliding unit, the kind designed for equipment access, with a smaller personnel door set into it on the right side. The personnel door was where the chain and padlock were. He could see the chain from where he stood, a heavy gauge loop through the exterior hasp, the padlock hanging at waist height. He assessed it for 30 seconds. The chain was substantial, but the hasp was looped through with standard agricultural hardware, screwed into the door frame rather than welded, which meant the weakest point in the system was not the chain or the lock, but the screws holding the hasp to the wood. Bolt cutters on the chain would work, but would require more force and more noise than he wanted produced in proximity to a guard making 22-minute passes. An alternative that had not been in his original plan presented itself now that he was close enough to see the hardware clearly. He had a pry bar in his go bag. The hasp screws would give faster and quieter than the chain if he applied the bar correctly, and the result was the same: door open, people out. He made the adjustment in his plan without ceremony and moved on to the next assessment. The extraction route from the barn to the field was the piece he needed to walk before he could finalize the approach. He had identified it on the previous night's reconnaissance as a line that ran south from the barn along the fence line to the corner, then west across open ground to the ditch, then south along the ditch to the gravel lane crossing. It was the most direct route that kept the barn structure between the group and the prefab communications unit for the maximum portion of the transit, which was the single most important geometric factor in an extraction that needed to avoid line of sight from the one building on the property that had active personnel in it. He walked it now, alone, in real time, counting his steps and clocking the transit at just under 4 minutes for a single person moving at controlled pace. For 3 people in unknown physical condition, he estimated 6 to 8 minutes to the ditch and another 4 to gravel lane. 10 to 12 minutes of open movement from barn to the first covered position. That was a long time in a space with active personnel and a 22-minute guard cycle, but it was workable if the timing was right and the group moved with discipline from the first step. He crossed the gravel lane and moved back into the overgrown ditch on the north side and sat with his back against the bank and ran the full plan from entry to barn to extraction to field crossing in his head one complete time, looking for gaps. There was one gap he couldn't close from his current position: the physical condition of the people in the barn. Cassie had assessed through voice and through the quality of her thinking, which was sharp enough to suggest she was managing her situation rather than being managed by it. The others were unknown quantities. Dex and Petra were names without data, and names without data were variables he had to plan around rather than plan for, which meant building more buffer into the movement timeline than he would need if everyone in the group was capable and cooperative. He added 3 minutes to his extraction estimate and accepted the number as his working assumption. He was back at the barn corner at the 40-minute mark in the guard cycle, 2 full passes since he had left the ditch, and he put his mouth to the gap at the base of the personnel door and made the same 4-second tone he had used the previous night to identify himself to Cass. The response came in under 10 seconds this time, which told him she had been positioned near the door and waiting. Her voice through the gap was the same compressed control register as before, and she led with the one piece of information he needed most before anything else. Dex could walk. Petra could walk. Nobody was injured. Hank let the relief of that land for exactly the second it deserved, and then moved past it. He told her the change to the hasp rather than the chain. He told her the route: south along the fence, west of the ditch, south to the lane. He told her to keep the group tight, no more than 3 feet between each person, and to match his pace exactly regardless of what their instinct told them about speed. He told her that if something went wrong between the barn and the ditch, she was to take the group flat to the ground and stay there until he resolved it. And that flat and still was always the right answer when the right answer wasn't obvious. She said she understood. He believed her. He told her the window opened in 1 hour and 40 minutes and have everyone on their feet and ready to move 5 minutes before he came through the door. She said okay, and the gap went quiet, and Hank moved back along the siding to the barn corner and settled into wait with his back against the cold metal and the night sitting around him, and 1 hour and 39 minutes on his watch before everything he had spent 31 years preparing for was going to come down to 10 minutes of movement across open ground in the dark with 3 people he had never met. The wait was the hardest part. Not because Hank was uncomfortable with stillness, but because stillness underground with controlled variables was different from stillness in an open environment where the unknowns were atmospheric and numerous, and the only thing managing them was his preparation and his judgment. He ran the plan again. Then again. Not anxiety, discipline. By 40 minutes to the window, he had run 11 times, and it had the smooth quality of something worn into shape by repetition. He checked his go bag by touch. Pry bar at the top, medical kit in the side pocket, water bottles positioned for easy handoff. He confirmed the sidearm retention without drawing it. The plan governed. At 15 minutes to the window, the guard made his pass. Footsteps before figure. Standard pace. No variation suggesting heightened alertness. The figure passed 4 feet from where Hank stood in the shadow and kept moving. Hank did not move, did not adjust his breathing, did not change anything. The guard's footsteps receded. 13 minutes. He moved to the personnel door and positioned himself in front of the hasp with the pry bar in his right hand and his left hand braced against the door frame. The technique he had decided on was a single controlled application of leverage angled to pull the hasp screws cleanly from the wood rather than strip them. Cleaner exit from the wood meant less sound and less resistance. He had one chance to do it right before the sound profile changed from acceptable to problematic, and he took 30 seconds to confirm his grip and his angle and his body position before he applied any pressure at all. When he was satisfied he was in the right position, he applied the bar in a single smooth motion, transferred his weight through his forearm and wrist rather than muscling it, and felt the screws given a sequence. First the bottom 2, then the top, the whole hasp coming free with a sound that was less than it anticipated and more than he wanted, but within the range he had planned for. He caught the hasp before it swung and held it against the door for 3 seconds, listening. Nothing changed in the ambient sound of the compound. He pulled the personnel door open 6 inches and put his mouth to the gap. He said one word. Now. The door opened from inside immediately. Cass had her hand on it, and 3 people came through the gap in the order he had asked for. Cass first and the others, each one moving through the door and immediately pressing to the barn wall on the south side, without being told to, because Cass had told them and they had listened. He got his first look at them in the moonlight against the barn wall. Cass was exactly what her voice had suggested. Controlled, alert, her eyes moving to him and then immediately to the surrounding ground the way a person's eyes moved when they were assessing rather than reacting. Dex was taller than he had pictured, broad across the shoulders, his face carrying the specific hollowness of someone who had lost significant weight in a short period of time, his expression closed and difficult to read in the way that expressions were difficult to read when the person behind them had decided not to show you anything. Petra was smaller, dark-haired, watching him with the same quality of attention Cass had, but from a different angle, where Cass was looking at the environment. Petra was looking at him, evaluating, making a determination he didn't have time to wait for. He held up 3 fingers, pointed south along the fence line, and moved. They followed. They moved south along the fence line, in a tight single file. Hank first, Cass directly behind him, then Dex, then Petra at the rear. The spacing was right. Nobody was bunching up, and nobody was falling back. That was the first good sign. The second was that none of them were looking at the barn as they moved away from it. They were looking forward. That told him more about the 3 of them than anything Cass had said to the gap in the door. People who looked back were people who were still processing what they had left. These 3 were already ahead of it. The fence corner came up in under a minute. Hank turned west without stopping, and the group turned with him like they had rehearsed it. The open ground between the fence and the ditch was the most exposed section of the extraction route. No overhead cover, no structures to break their outline. Just flat dead grass under a 3/4 moon with a prefab communications unit sitting 200 yards to the north with a lit window. He kept his pace controlled, not slow enough to feel cautious. fast enough to cover ground. The ditch came up, and he dropped into it without hesitating and heard 3 sets of feet follow him down the near bank in sequence. He moved south along the ditch bottom and counted his steps, and at 80 steps he stopped and turned and looked at the group. All 3 of them were in the ditch. All 3 were looking at him. Nobody was breathing hard. Dex looked like he wanted to say something. Hank put 1 finger to his lips, and Dex closed his mouth. Good enough. He turned and kept moving. The gravel lane crossing was 30 yards ahead. He slowed as he approached it and went to one knee at the ditch edge and looked both directions along the lane before he crossed. Nothing moving in either direction. He stepped up out of the ditch, crossed the lane in 4 steps, and moved into the overgrown field on the south side without looking back, because looking back was not something the situation required. He heard the others cross behind him, 4 steps each. Clean, he pushed into the field vegetation and went to one knee and waited for the group to close on him. And when all 3 were within arm's reach, he leaned close to Cass and said 1 word into her ear: injuries. She shook her head once. He nodded and stood and turned west and moved into the field on a diagonal away from the lane and away from the fence lines on either side. The field was knee-high dead growth and dry, and his foot placement was deliberate with every step. The others behind him were doing the same. He could hear Petra picking her way through with the same care he was using. He could hear Dex less carefully, but carefully enough. The field crossing took 9 minutes, longer than his solo transit had taken. Still inside the window, the timber on the west side of the field took them in, and the change in ambient sound was immediate. The open-air acoustic of the field gave way to the close dampened quality of trees and undergrowth, and the group's movement became quieter without any of them being told to change anything. Timber had a way of doing that to people. Hank stopped at the first tree line and listened for a full minute. The night behind them was unchanged. No voices, no change in the guard pattern at the facility. No light sweeping the field they had just crossed. Nothing that suggested the empty barn had been discovered yet. He turned northwest and began moving through the timber on a heading that would bring them to the county road at a point half a mile north of where he had crossed on his inbound route. That was intentional. The inbound and outbound crossings were separated by distance, 2 data points on a map that did not connect at a single origin. He moved at a pace the group could sustain and checked behind him every 5 minutes by stopping and turning and looking. Every time he stopped the group, stopped with him without being told. Every time he turned, they were where they were supposed to be. Cass at 3 feet, Dex at 3 feet, Petra at 3 feet. The spacing held. He had not expected it to hold this well this early, and the fact that it did made the next hour feel like something other than what it was. The timber section ran for just under a mile before it opened onto the shallow scrub that bordered the county road on the east side. Hank went to one knee at the timber edge and studied the road and the ground on both sides of it for 2 full minutes before he moved. The road was empty. The moonlight lay across it flat and silver and uninterrupted. He crossed at a low run and moved into the scrub on the far side and turned and watched the group cross behind him. Cass smooth and low. Dex longer strides but controlled. Petra last, moving fast and clean, pulling into the scrub and going still before he had finished watching. He turned west and kept moving, and the scrub gave way to the old field section, and the old field gave way to the low ground that had cost him 7 minutes on the inbound route. He stopped at the edge of the low ground and studied it for 30 seconds. The soft section was unavoidable, but it was narrower at this point than where he had crossed inbound. He picked the firmest line through it and moved across on grass root matched the same way he had on the way in, and heard the others doing the same behind him. Nobody punched through into soft soil. Nobody left a clean boot impression in bare ground. They came out of the low section onto firm ground and kept moving west, and the hardwood timber on the eastern edge of his property came up in the moonlight ahead of him like something he had been away from for a long time. He had been away from it for less than 4 hours. It felt longer than that. He entered the timber and went to one knee and turned and waited for the group to come in behind him. When all three were in the timber, he held up a closed fist and they stopped. He listened to the night for 2 full minutes. His property, his timber, the sounds it made at night were sounds he knew the way he knew his own breathing. Nothing was out of place. He stood and turned and moved northwest of the timber toward the workshop, and the group moved with him, and nobody said anything, and the night stayed exactly what it had been since he had first stepped out of the workshop door 4 hours ago. Empty, enormous, and now, for the first time since the grid went dark, not entirely without people on the side of it, he stopped the group 60 yards from the workshop, one finger to Cass. "Wait." She held the others back. Hank crossed to the workshop alone. Hand on the door. 10 seconds of listening. Nothing had changed. He went to the false decking and pressed his ear to it. Silence below. He went back to the door and waved the group in. They crossed the open ground in the same single file they had used all night and came through the workshop door one at a time, and Hank pulled the door shut behind Petra. And the 4 of them stood in the dark of the workshop in the specific silence that comes after a sustained period of control movement. Nobody spoke. Hank moved to the false decking and lifted it, and the smell of the bunker came up through the opening. Cool and clean and mechanical, the smell of something that had been sealed and managed and maintained. He went down first. He stood at the bottom and looked up through the opening, and Cass came down next without hesitating, and the others followed. And when Petra's feet hit the bunker floor, Hank reached up and pulled the decking back into position above them, and they were underground and the surface was sealed above their heads. He turned the overhead lights on. The bunker opened up around them, and he heard one of them draw a breath at the scale of it. He had lived in it for 30 days, and he still saw it clearly enough to understand why a person seeing it for the first time would react that way. He turned and looked at the 3 of them standing in his bunker for the first time. Cass was looking at the monitoring station. Dex was looking at the food storage shelving. Petra was looking at him. He said the first words he had said at any volume since he had stepped out of the workshop 4 hours ago. He said them quietly because quiet was a habit now, and habits were hard to break all at once. He said, "You're safe. Nobody is going to find you here. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we figure out the rest." Dex sat down on the floor where he was standing and put his face in his hands, and his shoulders moved once. Just once. Petra put her hand on his back and left it there. Cass kept looking at the monitoring station for a moment longer, and then turned to Hank and said 2 words. "Thank you." He nodded. He went to the monitoring station and sat in his chair and brought up the camera feeds, and the surface looked back at him the way it always had, dark and still and giving nothing away. He opened his log to a fresh page and dated it. Then he wrote a single line, "For people in the bunker." He looked at it for a moment. Then he added 4 more words beneath it. "First time for everything." The Voss morning transmission came through at 5:08 a.m. Hank had his recorder running before the carrier opened. Standard sector updates. Logistics. Personnel positioning. Nothing suggesting awareness of the extraction. No mention of the facility. No alert language. The GAR rotation ran 22 minutes. The hasp would have been found on the next pass after they cleared the fence. Discovery somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes after they crossed the county road. By the time the transmission went out, the barn had been empty for 3 hours. Voss said nothing about it. That absence was more interesting to Hank than anything Voss could have said. Missing detainees 36 hours before Reversion should have generated a response. It had not. Either Voss did not know yet, or Voss knew and was not mentioning it on this frequency, meaning a secondary channel Hank wasn't monitoring, or the detainees had been allowed to exist for a purpose Hank hadn't identified, and their absence was anticipated. He wrote all 3 options in his log, assigned each a probability, and closed the notebook. The bunker was quiet. Behind the sleeping quarters curtain, he could hear 3 people finally unconscious. That sound was so foreign after 30 days of total silence that he sat with it for a full minute. He ran his morning systems check. Battery banks nominal. Ventilation clean. Water filtration running. The bunker running exactly as it had for 30 days. The only difference was the head count. The camera feeds showed the surface empty and gray. No walkers. The road empty. The abandoned vehicle still in the tree line. Everything exactly as it had been every morning for a month. Except 6 miles east there was an empty barn with a hasp on the ground. And the man responsible was sitting underground drinking coffee and watching for screens. What came next had a shape. 36 hours left on the window. A voice on a radio that would keep transmitting until whatever was building was finished or until something stopped it. Hank was not yet sure what stopping it looked like, but he was sure of one thing. He had not been sure of 36 days ago when the grid went dark. He was not alone anymore. Hank gave them 6 hours of sleep and used every minute of it. He sat at the monitoring station and worked through what he knew about Voss's operation with the 3 new variables the previous night had introduced, Cass, Dex, and Petra, and what each of them represented in terms of both asset and liability going forward. Cass was an asset from the first minute. Her ability to organize the others in the barn, to position them correctly for a fast exit, to move through the extraction without a single misstep told him she was someone who had been competent before the collapse and had stayed competent under conditions that broke most people. Dex was harder to read, capable physically. That much was clear from the way he had moved through the field and the timber. But the closed expression and the moment on the bunker floor with his face in his hands suggested someone carrying weight that could become a problem under pressure. Not a liability yet. A variable. Petra was the one who interested him most. She had watched him the entire time from the moment he opened the barn door to the moment the bunker hatch sealed above them. Not the environment, not the route. Him. That kind of focused assessment in a person who had just been extracted from a detention facility under stress was not a common behavioral profile, and Hank had been around enough people in enough difficult situations to know that uncommon behavioral profiles were worth paying attention to. He added notes on all 3 to his log, and then turned to camera feeds and watched the surface move through the early morning light, and monitored the Voss frequency and let the 6 hours run. When Cass came through the sleeping quarters curtain first, he was not surprised. She moved to the monitoring station and stood beside his chair and looked at the screens the way he looked at them. Not as a passive observer, but as someone extracting information. He gave her a minute with them before he said anything. Then he asked her what she knew about reversion, and she told him. And what she told him over the next 20 minutes filled in the gaps in his picture in ways that reordered several of the assumptions he had been operating on since the first Voss transmission. Reversion was not a single event. It was a process with phases, the first of which had already begun in the sectors furthest from the protected infrastructure zones. It moved inward, systematic, sector by sector. Their sector was scheduled as the 4th wave, which was why the timing had compressed the way it had. The first 3 waves had moved faster than the original schedule because the population in the outer sectors had been lower than projected, which meant fewer people to process and a faster transition to the next phase. The assessment team's Hank had been watching on his cameras for 30 days with a leading edge of reversion, not a precursor to it. The cataloging was reversion. The organized movement was reversion. It had been happening in front of his cameras the whole time, and he had seen the mechanism without fully identifying the function. Cass had identified it because she had been inside it. She had been taken by an assessment team on day 11, her and Dex and Petra, and 4 others who had not made it through the month in the barn. And what the assessment team had done with them in the first 48 hours was a piece of information that reordered everything. They had been registered, photographed, documented, evaluated against a skill set matrix that the assessment team carried on printed sheets because nothing digital was running. Registered individuals were not subject to reversion. Registered individuals were assets to be deployed in the reconstruction phase that followed reversion in each sector. The barn had not been a holding facility. It had been a processing backlog. The detainees had already been registered and were waiting for assignment. Hank sat with that for a long moment. Then he asked a question that followed directly from it. She nodded before he finished asking it. Yes, she said. If they were registered and they were now absent from the facility, Voss's people would eventually look for them. Not immediately. The registration system was administrative, and the reconstruction phase was still a sector away. But eventually the names on those printed sheets would be cross-referenced against the people who showed up for deployment, and 3 names would be missing. And the search that followed would be methodical, because everything Voss ran was methodical. Hank turned back to his camera feeds. He thought about the trail discipline he had maintained on the extraction route. 2 separate crossing points on the county road. Approach and exit offset. Low ground crossed on route mats. No boot impressions in bare soil. He had run it as clean as he knew how to run it, and he had been running this kind of thinking for 31 years. But clean was not invisible, and methodical searches eventually covered all the ground there was. He looked at the 4 screens showing his property and the surrounding area and thought about how long clean bought him, and whether it was long enough to do what the situation now required before the search reached his property line. Dex came through the sleeping quarters curtain while Hank was still thinking, and Petra came through behind him, and the 4 of them sat in the bunker in a silence that had a different quality than the silence of the previous 30 days. Fuller, more complicated. Hank broke it by asking Cass how many assessment teams she had seen operating in their sector. She said 3 that she knew of. He asked if the teams had a base location. She said the facility they had just left was the closest thing to a base she had seen. He asked about the prefab communications unit, and she told him it ran on a dedicated power cell and a satellite uplink that the assessment teams used for encrypted burst transmissions to Central, separate from the shortwave network Voss used for field reports. 2 channels. Hank had known about the second channel as a possibility since the morning after the extraction, when the Voss transmission had been silent on the missing detainees. Now he knew what it was and how it worked, and that information was the most tactically significant thing he had learned since he first found the Voss frequency 30 days ago. Encrypted burst transmissions to Central meant that Voss's reporting up the chain was not happening on a frequency Hank could monitor. It meant there was a layer of communication above what he had access to, and that layer was where the decisions were actually being made. He asked Cass if she had ever heard the burst transmissions. She said no. She said the equipment in the prefab ran on a cycle she had observed from the barn window, and the transmissions were inaudible, but the antenna orientation changed when a burst went out. He asked her how often. She said twice daily. He asked her what times. She told him, and the times did not match the Voss shortwave cycle. They ran 6 hours offset. Morning shortwave, midday burst. Evening shortwave, midnight burst. Hank opened his log and wrote the burst transmission schedule in the margin next to his Voss frequency notes, and looked at what he had written and thought about what a man with a shortwave radio and a Faraday-lined bunker and 3 people who had just been inside the operation could do with the information currently in this room. He did not have an answer yet, but he had 31 years of practice turning incomplete information into actionable plans, and the information in this room was far from incomplete. He looked at Cass. He looked at Dex. He looked at Petra. Then he opened his planning notebook to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top. Next move. The picture that assembled itself over the next hour was larger and more detailed than anything 30 days of solo surveillance had produced. 3 people inside the operation for a month knew things no camera or radio could have given him. Cass knew the assessment team personnel rotation. She knew that the 3 teams in their sector shared personnel, and that the overlap meant there were periods of reduced coverage on specific routes. She had memorized them the way Hank had memorized the walker patterns. Not because she had a plan, but because information was the only currency she had. Dex knew the registration system. He had been cooperative with the assessment team in ways Cass had not, and had seen the skill matrix sheets up close. The categories were specific: medical training, mechanical skills, agricultural knowledge, construction experience, communications expertise. Reconstruction was not going to be improvised. Pre-selected people for predefined roles. Hank thought about his own skill set and said nothing. Petra had the third piece, and it was the one that changed the shape of everything the most. She had been held longer, at a different facility first, further east, before transfer to the barn. At the first facility, she had overheard something the assessment team did not realize she was positioned to hear. A timeline, not the reversion timeline. A different one. A date 8 weeks out from the collapse, by which Central expected the cleared zones in their region to be ready for what the assessment team had called the arrival. Petra did not know what the arrival was. The word had been used once before the conversation stopped, but it carried the weight of something everyone present already understood without explanation. The arrival, 8 weeks from the collapse. 2 weeks from now. Hank wrote the word in his notebook, boxed it, and looked at his camera feeds. Surface unchanged. The walkers appeared on camera too, and he logged them without looking away from the word. The arrival, a fixed point on a timeline already running. 14 days to determine what position everyone in this bunker was in when it arrived. He thought about Boyd, still out there somewhere in the cleared zone with no idea what was coming, and no preparation to meet it. He thought about the registration system and the skill matrix, and whether Boyd's decades of agricultural knowledge put him on a list somewhere that Voss's people were going to act on before the arrival made that list irrelevant. He thought about what it meant to have 4 people in a bunker with 31 years of supplies and equipment and intelligence accumulated across 30 days of surveillance, when the thing that was coming had a name nobody in the room could define. He stopped thinking about what he did not know and focused on what he did. The sector, the patrol patterns, the communications architecture, the registration system, the burst transmission channel. 3 people in this room who knew things no camera or radio could have given him. All of them unregistered in the eyes of anyone looking. That last point was the one that required the most immediate attention. Unregistered men off the grid in the most literal sense available, and off the grid was exactly where Hank had spent 31 years trying to be. He looked at the 3 of them and said what he had been thinking since Cass had told him about the registration system an hour ago. He said, "Nobody outside this bunker can know you are here. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The bunker stays secret the same way it has always stayed secret. We do not exist." They looked at him. Cass nodded first. Then Petra. Dex took a moment longer, and then nodded once, and the room was settled on something that did not need to be written down, because the people in it understood it well enough without that. Hank turned back to his planning notebook. The page with next move written at the top was still blank below the heading. He picked up his pen and started writing, and did not stop for a long time. The bunker had a rhythm now that it hadn't had before, and Hank noticed it the way he noticed everything. Quietly, without comment, filing it under variables to account for. For people sharing a space designed for one long-term occupant created friction that had nothing to do with conflict and everything to do with the simple physics of bodies and needs and schedules overlapping in a confined environment. Dex was up before anyone else each morning and spent the first hour sitting at the far end of the storage room with his back against the shelving and his knees pulled up and his eyes on the middle distance. Hank noted it without addressing it. A man working through something needed the space to work through it, and commentary from someone he had known for less than 48 hours was not the kind of help that actually helped. Petra moved to a bunker like she was mapping it, which she probably was, and Hank respected that instinct even when it meant she appeared silently at his shoulder while he was monitoring the radio, and watched what he was doing without asking permission. He let her watch. She was learning the operation, and a person learning the operation was a person becoming useful. Cass was the one he talked to, not because she was more approachable than the others, but because she had information he needed and the patience to deliver it in the careful, organized way that made it most useful. They sat at the monitoring station each morning after the Voss transmission, and she walked him through everything she had seen and heard during her time in the facility, and he wrote it down and cross-referenced it against his log, and the picture kept getting sharper. By day 2 underground, the picture was sharp enough that Hank had a working model of Voss's operation in their sector that he was reasonably confident in, and a set of questions about the wider operation that the information in this room could not answer. The burst transmission channel was the one he kept coming back to. Cass had given him the antenna orientation pattern she had observed from the barn window, a specific rotation that preceded each burst by approximately 3 minutes. If he could observe that rotation in real time, he could timestamp the burst against the shortwave cycle and build a picture of the reporting cadence between the sector level and central. He couldn't observe the antenna from his current camera positions. Camera 3 gave him a partial view of the property to the northeast, but the angle was wrong and the distance was too great for the analog resolution to pick up antenna movement. He needed a better position and a better camera, and getting either of those things meant going back to the surface in daylight, which was a different risk profile from the night extractions he had run so far. He sat with that problem for 2 days before Petra solved it. She had been studying his camera setup with the same quiet, systematic attention. She applied to everything in the bunker, and on the morning of day 3, she came to the monitoring station while he was on the radio and waited until the transmission ended, and then told him that camera 4 had a sight line to the northeast that could reach the facility property if the angle was adjusted by approximately 15 degrees. She said it the way a person says something they have already confirmed in their head and are now simply reporting. Hank looked at her. He asked how she knew what 15 degrees would show. She said she had been doing the geometry in her head using the camera positions and the terrain features visible on the current feeds and the distance estimates from the extraction route. He looked at her for another moment and then stood up and went to his conduit junction box and pulled the camera 4 line and adjusted the angle at the junction by the amount she had specified and reconnected it, and came back to the monitoring station and looked at the feed. The facility roof line was visible at the upper left edge of the frame. The prefab communications unit was partially visible beyond it. The satellite antenna was visible above the prefab roofline. Hank sat down slowly. He looked at the antenna on the screen and then looked at Petra standing beside the desk and said nothing for a moment because there was nothing immediately useful to say. Then he said, "Pull up a chair." She did. They sat side by side at the monitoring station and watched the antenna, and Hank had his notebook open and his pen in his hand, and they waited. The first burst transmission window, based on Cass's timing, was 4 hours out. Hank used the 4 hours to brief Petra on everything he had logged about the Voss transmissions. The frequency, the format, the content categories, the phrases that had been most operationally significant. She listened without interrupting and asked 3 questions when he finished. All 3 were good questions. The first was whether the Voss shortwave transmissions were one-way or whether there were responses he wasn't capturing. He told her he had heard no responses, but that the absence of response didn't mean responses weren't happening on a frequency he wasn't monitoring. The second was whether the transmission timing had ever varied significantly from the established pattern. He told her about the 11-minute extended transmission on day 28 that had revealed the national scope of the operation. The third question was the one that stopped him. She asked whether Voss had ever said anything that suggested awareness of a monitoring party. Hank looked at her. He thought about every transmission he had recorded and played back. He thought about the detail Voss had shared about the yield parameters of the initiation event in those first recordings. Technical specifications that had no audience purpose in a field report unless the speaker wanted them recorded. He thought about the non-standard frequency that had been clean enough to receive without equipment that most people would have in a world with power, let alone without it. He had been finding these transmissions. He had never asked himself whether the transmissions had been designed to be found. He wrote Petra's question in his notebook and underlined it and looked at the camera feed and the antenna sitting still against the sky and thought about 31 days of intelligence gathering that felt like discovery, and asked himself for the first time whether any part of it had been given. The burst transmission window opened 40 minutes later. The antenna rotated 3 minutes before the burst, exactly as Cass had described. Hank logged the timestamp and the rotation angle, and sat with the implications of Petra's question while the antenna held its position, and the burst went out to wherever Central was, and whatever was there received it. The surface on all 4 cameras was empty and still. Dex came out of the storage room and sat at the table and ate without speaking. Cass came through the sleeping quarters curtain and looked at Hank's face and then at his notebook and then at the camera feed showing the antenna, and understood without being told that something had shifted. She sat down. Nobody said anything. The bunker held them all in its quiet, and the monitors ran, and Hank's pen moved across the page, and outside 40 feet above their heads, the world Voss had built kept moving forward on its schedule, completely unaware that 4 people underground were starting to understand it well enough to think about what came next. Boyd appeared on camera one that afternoon. Hank saw him first and said nothing, moving along the north fence line the same way he had before, slow, hunched, stopping every few steps. He looked worse than 3 days ago. Weight loss visible even at camera distance, moving like someone running low on everything. He reached the gate and stopped with his hand on the latch. Same calculation, same eyes. Cass had moved to the station when she heard Hank go still. She asked who it was. Hank told her. She said, "He looks bad." Hank said, "Yes." She said, "What are you going to do?" He said nothing for a moment. Boyd's hand was on the gate latch. The bunker was secret. That was the foundation. That was the rule that did not have exceptions, except that the rule had been written for a world where the bunker was one man's survival strategy, and the man who lived in it was accountable only to himself. The world the rule had been written for was not the world currently visible on 4 camera feeds. Dex came next, then Petra, all 4 of them watching Boyd at the gate. Nobody said anything. Hank looked at the 3 of them. He looked at the gate. He looked at Boyd's hand on the latch. He thought about the arrival, the skill matrix, 30 years of cattle farming in a world being rebuilt from nothing. He stood and went to the gear prep area and put on his jacket. Cass asked where he was going. He said, to open the gate. She said, "I thought the bunker stays secret." He said, "It does." Boyd doesn't need to see the entrance. He just needs water and a direction and someone to tell him what is actually happening. Cass looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Take water." He grabbed 2 water bottles, climbed through the false decking, crossed to the workshop door, and stepped out into cold afternoon light for the first time since the extraction. Daylight hit differently. The world looked larger, more ruined, more final. He crossed the property to the north gate at a direct walk, and Boyd saw him coming from 50 yards out, and went completely still the way a person went still when they couldn't decide between relief and fear. Hank held up both water bottles, so they were visible, and kept walking. Boyd's hand stayed on the latch. His eyes stayed on Hank. Hank reached the gate and stopped on the side of it, and held out one of the bottles through the wire, and said, "Drink this first." Boyd took it. He drank half of it without stopping, and then lowered it and looked at Hank with the expression of a man who had been alone with very bad information for too long. Hank said, "I know what's coming." Boyd said, "What's coming?" Hank said, something with a name. Then he told him enough of it to make Boyd understand that the choice in front of him was real and the timeline was short. He did not tell him about the bunker. He told him there was a safe location on this property and that if Boyd wanted to reach it, he needed to be back at this gate at midnight, and he needed to tell nobody and bring nobody. Boyd looked at the property behind Hank, then back at Hank. He said, "You've been here the whole time." Not a question. Hank said, "Yes." Boyd finished the water, handed the bottle back, said midnight. Hank said midnight. He walked back to the workshop, sealed the door, and went back down through the false decking. When he came back through the entrance, all three were at camera 1. Boyd still at the gate, looking at the property. Then he turned and walked away, and the camera tracked him until he left the frame. Hank sat down at his desk. He opened his log, wrote Boyd's name, wrote midnight beneath it, wrote 5 people beneath that, set the pen down. The monitors ran. The bunker was quiet. Outside, the surface moved to the cold afternoon toward dark, and somewhere 6 miles east, a satellite antenna sat on the roof of a prefab building pointing at a sky that didn't care who was watching. And somewhere above that sky, something was coming that had a name nobody in this room could fully define yet, and 14 days to arrive. Boyd was at the gate at 11:58 p.m. Hank was watching camera 1 when he appeared out of the dark, and he had the specific quality of movement that told Hank he had spent the intervening hours thinking hard about whether to come and had decided yes with enough time left over to arrive early. That was a good sign. A man who showed up early to something difficult had already done the hard internal work. Hank went up through the false decking alone and crossed the gate and opened it, and Boyd stepped through without a word, and Hank pulled it shut, and they walked back across the property toward the workshop side by side in the cold dark. Boyd said nothing on the walk across. Hank said nothing either. There was nothing that needed saying in the open air, and everything that needed saying could wait until they were underground. He brought Boyd to the workshop door and closed it and stood in the dark and said, "There is an entrance in the floor. You go down first and I follow." Boyd looked at the floor. He looked at Hank. He said, "How long have you had this?" Hank said, "A long time." Boyd nodded once and said nothing else, and Hank lifted the false decking, and Boyd looked down into the lit space below and descended the ladder without hesitating, and Hank came down behind him and pulled the decking back into position, and they were underground, and the bunker opened around Boyd the way it had opened around the others, and his reaction was different from theirs. He didn't draw a breath at the scale of it. He looked around slowly with the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental about his understanding of the person he thought he knew, and then he nodded the same slow nod he had nodded at the gate and said, "That's why you never talked." Hank said, "Yes." Boyd said, "Smart." Cass and Petra were at the monitoring station. Dex was at the table. Boyd looked at all 3 of them, and they looked at him, and Hank let the moment settle before he moved them past it. He sat Boyd down at the table and gave him food and water and sat across from him and talked while Boyd ate. He told him everything. The EMP, the cameras, the Voss transmissions, the assessment teams, Reversion, the arrival. He laid it out in the same order. He had assembled it over 31 days, and Boyd ate and listened, and his expression moved through several phases. Disbelief, recognition, anger, and finally the specific stillness of a man who had suspected something was wrong without having a framework to define it, and was now being given a framework and finding that it fit the shape of what he had been seeing in the cleared zone for the past month. When Hank finished, Boyd put down his fork and said, "The people who came to the county road 2 weeks ago." They wrote things down. Hank said, "A skill matrix." Boyd said, "They asked me about the cattle operation, about the acreage, about whether I had seed stock." Hank said, "You're on a list." Boyd looked at him. He said, "Is that good or bad?" Hank said, "It means they want you functional. For now." Boyd sat with that and then said, "What about after?" Hank said, "That's the question." He looked at Cass. She told Boyd what she had told Hank about reversion and registration and the reconstruction timeline, and Boyd listened with the same stillness he had brought to everything else, and when she finished, he said, "So they planned all of it." She said, "All of it?" Boyd looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at Hank and said, "What do we do?" Hank had been thinking about that question since Petra had asked him whether Voss's transmissions had been designed to be found, and he had not had a complete answer until approximately 4 hours ago, when the pieces had assembled themselves in the quiet of the monitoring station, while the others slept and the surface cameras ran, and the antenna on the facility roof had rotated for its midnight burst transmission. He had written the answer in his planning notebook in the same careful way he wrote everything, and he had read it back 3 times. It was still the right answer on the 3rd reading, which meant it was probably actually right, and not just right in the way that plans felt right before they met reality. He opened the notebook and set it on the table and looked at the 4 people sitting and standing around a bunker that had been alone for 31 years and said, "We don't run and we don't hide. We already know more about this operation than anyone outside it is supposed to know. We have a communications channel they don't know we have. We have a 14-day window before the arrival, and we have no idea what the arrival is, but we know the timeline and the infrastructure and the people running it, and that is more than anyone else has." Boyd said, "You want to fight them?" Hank said, "I want to understand them first." Dex said, "There are 3 assessment teams in this sector. We are 5 people." Hank said, "I know." Dex said, "So what exactly is the plan?" Hank looked at him. He said, "The plan is to know more than they do for as long as we can, and to use that window to do something that matters before the arrival changes everything." Cass said, "What does that look like in practice?" Hank said, "It looks like this." He turned the planning notebook so they could all see it. He had written a single word at the top of the page the same way he always started a new objective, and that word was the most honest summary of what the next 14 days needed to be. Intelligence. Not resistance yet. Not engagement. Just a relentless accumulation of everything they could learn about an operation that had been built in secret and was now running in the open because it believed nobody was watching. He looked at the 4 of them. He looked at his monitors. He looked at the word on the page. Then Petra said the thing that none of them had said yet, and that all of them had been thinking. She said, "Voss doesn't know we exist." Hank said, "No," she said. "So we are exactly what he built this entire operation to eliminate. People outside the system with nothing to lose, and enough information to cause damage." Hank looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." The bunker was quiet. The monitors ran. Outside, the surface sat cold and dark under a clearing sky, and 6 miles east an empty barn stood with a hasp on the ground, and somewhere above the cleared zone a satellite pointed at something coming that had a name and a timeline, and no reason at all to believe that 5 people in a hole in the ground had spent the last 36 days learning how to be the one thing it hadn't planned for. The next morning, Hank ran the Voss transmission at 5:11 a.m. with all 4 of them at the monitoring station for the first time. He watched their faces the way he watched everything. Quietly, Boyd listened with his arms crossed. Dex leaned forward with his eyes closed. Petra watched the camera feeds while she listened, cross-referencing audio against visual the way Hank had been doing for 31 days. Cass wrote. She had asked for a notebook the previous evening, and was already 3 pages in when the transmission ended. When Voss went silent, she looked up from the notebook and said, "He referenced Sector 7. Hank said, "Yes." She said, "Sector 7 wasn't in any of his previous transmissions." Hank said, "No." She said, "The facility I was held at first was further east. I think it was Sector 7. Hank opened his log and ran back through 31 days of transmission notes and confirmed it. Sector 7 had not appeared once in 31 days of transmissions. It appeared this morning in a logistics context. Resupply coordination, personnel staging, coming online ahead of schedule. Ahead of schedule. Hank wrote that phrase in the margin and looked at it. The sectors were not all on the same timeline. Sector 7, ahead, meant the compression would propagate forward. He did the math. Not 14 days. 11, maybe 10. Boyd said, "How much time did we just lose?" Hank said, 3 days. Maybe 4. Dex said, "So what changes?" Hank said, "The order of what we do and how fast we do it." He turned his planning notebook and started revising. The intelligence phase was still the right first move, but the window for passive accumulation had just gotten significantly shorter, and that meant some of what it planned to observe and confirm before acting needed to be compressed or cut. He went through the plan line by line. Cass beside him, Petra behind, Boyd and Dex at the table. 5 people working through something together in a space built for one, for other minds on a problem. Different from what he had expected, better in some ways. Dex asked questions that revealed gaps in the plan Hank hadn't seen because he had been too close to it. Petra made 2 suggestions that were operationally sound and that Hank incorporated without discussion because they were simply correct. Boyd contributed the one piece of local knowledge that none of the others had. He knew the farm properties in the sector in a way that Hank's camera coverage hadn't fully captured, and he identified 2 locations adjacent to the assessment team patrol routes that offered observation positions Hank hadn't considered. By mid-morning, the revised plan had a shape that was tighter and more capable than what Hank had built alone, and he sat with that for a moment because it required adjusting something he had held as a fixed truth for a very long time. One man alone was the safest configuration. One man alone was undetectable. One man alone controlled all the variables. All of that was still true as far as it went. What was also true, and what the morning had demonstrated in a way that 31 years of solo preparation had not, was that one man alone had blind spots that he couldn't identify because they were blind spots, and that 5 people with different skills and different knowledge and different angles on the same problem produced something that one man alone could not produce regardless of how prepared that man was. He didn't write that in his log. He thought it, and he knew it was true, and he moved on because there was work to do, and the window was 10 days, and the thing with a name was coming whether they were ready for it or not. What they had was each other, and the bunker, and 31 days of intelligence, and the specific advantage of being people that a very large and very organized operation had not accounted for. Hank looked at the monitors. He looked at his planning notebook. He looked at the 4 people in his bunker who had been strangers a week ago and who were now the only other people on the planet who knew what he knew. He thought about the word Voss had never said on any frequency Hank had ever monitored, the word for what happened when a plan met something it hadn't planned for. He picked up his pen and opened his log to a fresh page and dated it, and wrote one line at the top and looked at it for a moment before he closed the notebook over it and turned back to monitors. The line said, "They don't know we're here. Not yet.